that's why Muslims go to Medina or Mecca or both for pilgrimage, and that's one of the duties. How many know what the Ummah is in Islam? Okay, well, this is an important concept. In the United States, we have citizens, and all countries have citizens. Well, Islam has citizens too. Islam is a one-world government, and the Ummah is the people of Islam. And a Muslim's first loyalty is to the Ummah, to Islam. And the Ummah is ruled by a caliphate, and the caliph is the successor to Muhammad. And the superficial distinctions between the various Muslim countries like Jordan or Pakistan, these are distinctions that were basically imposed by Western civilization through the colonial period by dividing up parts of the world that were ruled by the English and the French and so forth. And the Muslims want to return. They believe that eventually what they call the Mahdi or the 12th Imam will return, and he will lead them. He will be like a Messiah, and he will lead them in breaking down these boundaries, uniting all the Muslims into one organization, and then taking over the world. So yeah, it's important to remember that a Muslim's first loyalty is to the Ummah, not to the nation that he lives in. You all know what Dar al-Harb is? And Dar es-Salam, or Dar al-Salam, as Edmund pointed out to me, depending on whether you want to say House of Peace or House of Islam. Well, the Dar al-Harb is the part of the world that has not yet been conquered by Islam. And it's noteworthy that Muslims refer to the part of the world not yet conquered as the House of War. Because if a part of the world is not yet within Islam, then Islam regards it as at war, continually at war. Now, I've got to go do a bit of an aside here, because otherwise I can see I'm going to lose you on one point. Are there peaceful Muslims? Of course. Were there peaceful Germans during World War II? Of course. But they weren't able to stop the aggressive Germans. They weren't able to stop the Nazis. There were probably people in Japan who didn't want to attack Pearl Harbor, but they weren't able to stop the imperial militarists of the Japanese army. You have to look at this from the sense of what are their true loyalties and what are their real capabilities in dealing with the situation. And Islam has a history of going into periods of relative passivity, and then when they start to have some successes somewhere, then the whole of Islam fires up and gets behind it. And we're coming out of a long period of dormancy for Islam, because when they fell behind technologically, they lost their ability to plunder. They lost their ability to get spoils and booty from the rest of the world. I'm just going to give you a touch of an overview. Just as an example, Islam spent 500 years conquering India and another 500 years ruling India. They killed an estimated 60 million Hindus during that time, and during the whole time, they continued to take all of the wealth that India could produce. India was once one of the world's advanced countries and a wealthy country, and they reduced it to rubble. And with that spoil, they built their armies. They would go out at intervals of 3 to 5 years on raiding parties, and they would have a course planned out, and they knew how many slaves they wanted to get, and they knew how much wealth they wanted to get and how much they could carry back, and they would do this over and over and over again through the centuries. Every part of the world that you can imagine, except the core of Western Europe and deep Russia, places like that, every place like that was raided out of. I'll just give you some rough numbers on to try to help you without going through all the detail. You all know how horrible the African slave trade was that the Europeans and Americans engaged in. Did you know that the Muslims were conducting an African slave trade for 8 centuries before any slaves went to Europe? They took 17 to 18 million slaves out of Africa. Did you know that they took slaves from places like Moscow and Odessa and Kiev in the Ukraine for centuries and centuries?
From Poland too.
From where?
Poland.
From Poland too, yes, absolutely.
Tartars.
Yep.
Who were Muslims.
There's an excellent book on that. It's called The Legacy of Jihad by a guy by the name of Boston. And what it is a collection of Islamic writings. So and it's not all Islamic, it's other contemporaries, but much of it's Islamic. And the numbers for their slave raids come from the tallies that the Muslim commanders themselves put together. I'm getting off track, but I wanted to give you a sense that this is not a small thing that just went on here and there. It's gone on from the very beginning of Islam. And why we're deceived right now is because Western power was so great that we were able to suppress Islam, and the Soviet Union was able to suppress Islam. And Islam retreated in defeat and humiliation with no ability to gain the resources to start new jihads. So they were locked in under a colonial system, and it freed the people who were being exploited and pursued by the Muslims so relentlessly. It freed them to self-determination. But now that's breaking down for a variety of reasons, but one significant reason is the oil wealth of the Middle East makes it possible for them to finance jihad again, and that's what they're doing. I kind of got off my topic here. Dar al-Am, A-M-N, is the third house. And Dar al-Am is the Western countries, the non-Islamic countries that will allow Muslims to operate what we refer to as stealth jihad. And stealth jihad is all of the collateral activities, propaganda, sabotage, deception, anything that you can come up with that supports a jihad. So all Muslims are called on to jihad, but not necessarily a violent, aggressive military jihad. There are other things they can do. A university professor here telling everybody that Islam is a religion of peace and that jihad is an inner struggle, he's practicing stealth jihad, because the idea of jihad as anything but war is a recent political invention. Jihad has been holy war for centuries. Now I talked about the Quran, and I wanted to mention something about the way that it's organized. It's organized in what are called surahs, verses. And when we think of the Bible, we think of it as being written chronologically, which it is. When you think of the Quran, you normally would assume that it must be written chronologically. The order in which Allah gave revelations through Gabriel to Muhammad must be the same as how they're transcribed in the Quran. But that's just not the case. For some reason, when they collected all of this, they put it in the order of the shortest to the longest. So there's a doctrine in Islam called abrogation. And that means if you read the Quran from beginning to end, you'll come on verses that are peaceful in the beginning and near the end. And you'll come across verses that are violent in the beginning and near the end. And you go, well, maybe it's sort of a little peaceful, a little violent. Well, the verses that are violent were written in the Medina period after Muhammad got power. And those verses all abrogate or supersede the earlier verses. So if you find a peaceful verse in the Quran that says there's to be tolerance among religions, you need to find out when that was delivered, because Allah contradicted himself frequently. And it's always the later verses, which happen to be the violent, aggressive ones, that take precedence. Muslims know that. Just as you know, for example, that there are things in the New Testament which fulfill and therefore replace concepts in the Old Testament, which were a lesser understanding of God. Muslims know that the Medina surahs supersede the old peaceful surahs. But when they want to quote the Quran to you to convince you that there are people of peace, they'll always quote the old ones that no longer have validity. I'll just briefly mention the hadith, because or sometimes called haditha, because you need to know this too. The Quran is not self-explanatory because it doesn't have that many directly doctrinal statements compared to the number of illustrative statements, stories. And so the hadith is a collection of stories independent of the word of the angel Gabriel. It's a collection of stories that describe the conduct of Muhammad and his immediate followers during his lifetime. And wherever there's any doubt about what the Quran means, these stories are used to illustrate what it should mean. So, for example, if you have any doubt about what should be done with an infidel who is captured and refuses to convert, well, first of all, if the infidel is not a person of the book, either a Christian or a Jew, then there's really no other alternatives. They either go into slavery, which was generally reserved for women and children, or they're killed. And the men who'd reached puberty were always killed. If you are a Christian or a Jew, you get three choices. You get the possibility of conversion, the possibility of dimitude, which I'll talk about in a second, or the possibility of death. But death for a Christian or a Jew who refused conversion and refused dimitude was a little bit more harsh. In that case, what Muhammad taught and did was you cut off the right hand and the left foot and you burn the eyes out. That's what he did personally, not just what he taught. And then you let him die of exposure. If you were in a hurry, he had another alternative, which was crucifixion, which Muslims did and do. For non-Christians, let's take for example Hindus. They were much quicker about it. They just beheaded all the men, and just as this is not the only thing, but a typical example of what they would do, they beheaded all the men and put the heads in a huge pile. And then they gathered all the women and children, and they bound them in a circle around the pile. And they tied them intermingled with each other, with their faces all toward the pile. And they left them there till they were near death, looking at the heads of their brothers and fathers and so forth. And then they marched them off into slavery. It's a system that was horribly ruthless and still is. That's why when you see these beheadings, these Daniel Pearl incidents, and you think, well, this is some fringe group of crazies, Islam would never do this. These are the things Islam did. These are the things Muhammad did. Now, is it important that Muhammad, all these centuries ago, did these things? Lots of people did bad things back then. We've grown past that, right? Only, guess what? Muhammad was the perfect man, the ideal of conduct forever. There's nothing that Muhammad did that Islam does not believe in today. Are there Muslims who say, oh yeah, well, we don't really believe that anymore? Yeah. There are Christians who don't really believe Christianity anymore. There are Christians who don't live their faith anymore. But that doesn't mean that the Christian message has changed just because these people don't live it. And the same applies to the Muslims. There's millions of Muslims who don't live this Quran, Muhammadan religion that their generations have brought forward. But there's no doctrinal body of any significance that says, well, these things that Muhammad did were bad, we don't believe in that anymore. Or that says Muhammad is not our ideal of conduct, or he's not really the final prophet of God. So you have to understand that because Muslims have gone into decline and into submission worldwide,